14-foot skeletons buried in ancient mounds, elongated skulls with DNA that doesn't match any known human population. Biblical texts describe the offspring of angels and mortal women, and every civilization that has ever existed seems to pass down stories of giants, beings of immense size and strength who once ruled this earth. Modern science calls them folklore, but history and archaeological evidence points to a different answer. Giants? They're real. This may come as a shock to some of you, but before researching this, I had no idea where giants came from. Doesn't it seem like they've always just been around in our collective human history since the beginning of history? Why does almost every culture on Earth have stories about them? We are going to dive in the deep end for the answers to those very questions. Let's start with a theory that is probably the most prominent one: the Nephilim. The rise of the Nephilim is just casually mentioned in the Bible, but extensively detailed in the Book of Enoch and the Book of Giants. Many of you may not have heard of these last two books because they're not considered canonical, not part of the official Bible. But even that statement's going to get me in trouble right off the bat, because the official Bible depends on whether you follow the Catholics and their 73 books or the Protestants with their 66 books. But neither version contains the Book of Enoch and the Book of Giants. However, that does not mean that we should not look to these books for important information. In fact, the Book of Enoch is referenced numerous times in other books of the Bible. And 11 copies of the Book of Enoch and 10 copies of the Book of Giants were found among the stash of religious documents known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. But before the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in caves off the northwest shore of the Dead Sea between roughly 1946 and 1956, we wouldn't have even known about the Book of Enoch if it weren't for the fact that it is contained in the Ethiopian Bible, which has 81 books. Clearly, early Christians were paying attention to what was written in these books. In any case, let's just start at the beginning. We have Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden as the start of all mankind. And to keep an eye on them, God appoints angels called the Watchers, not to be confused with the Dark Watchers of California, which we cover in a separate video. A link for that one will be in the description. Anyway, these Watchers are on Earth to babysit us as we develop. We all know from the earlier angel rebellion, when some angels were cast out of heaven, that angels, just like us, have free will. So these Watchers, they have free will as well. And just like it does for most of us, that gets some of the Watchers in trouble. As they're hanging out, just watching us multiply, they start to notice that some of the ladies down here are looking particularly captivating. That the sons of God saw the daughters of man, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. Genesis 6:2. Instead of staying out of sight, they decide to come down to earth and take wives and start families. 200 of them gather on top of Mount Hermon to swear an oath to one another, like the 200 musketeers, all for one and one for all, because they know that they are literally inviting the wrath of God for doing this. The Watchers take wives who bear them children, giants that we have come to know as the Nephilim. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them. The same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown. Genesis 6:4. And they're right. God ain't happy. But God gives the Nephilim 500 years to live, and they just tear it up all over Earth. They're always hungry, and when they can't find enough animals to eat, they start eating humans. Eventually, because they're inherently evil and out of control, they start warring amongst themselves and wipe themselves out for the most part. And not only do the Watchers taking wives from the daughters of men corrupt the flesh of men, but they also impart knowledge to men. Knowledge we weren't supposed to find out about, like how to make weapons, witchcraft, and how to make cosmetics. But even though the original generation of Nephilim might have killed each other off, according to the Bible, all of earthly flesh was now corrupted. All of it except Noah. Noah's line is the last line of purity, never mingled with Nephilim DNA. Neither were his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So when Noah's about ready to get on the boat 7 days before the flood, he is to quickly pick wives for his 3 sons. However, the Bible says all other flesh was corrupted. So here's Noah trying to pick wives for his sons out of a polluted pool. But he has no choice. You can't really populate the world without the ladies. So here we have this huge flood that is meant to wipe out not only all evil men, but all evil giants as well. But then we got to restart all of humanity with tainted DNA. After the worldwide flood, Noah's son Ham and his wife roll snake eyes and end up the winners of the defective gene pool, starting the lineage that is eventually known as the Canaanites, who were evil giants that God then tasked the Israelites with wiping out later. But I guess this way the evil had been brought down to a manageable size. Or another theory called the multiple incursions theory is that while the original 200 watchers who stood together on Mount Hermon and made a pinky swear to stick together were hunted down, bound, and tossed into the abyss until the final judgment day, another group of angels decided that taking a crack at the gorgeous earth women was worth the risk and fathered a whole new generation of giants, one that persists to this day. Now, depending on who you talk to, those giants might be real living creatures that roam the earth, hiding in caves, or, according to some researchers, the Nephilim have spirits that live on after they die, just like we do. So their spirits remain to roam the earth forever, continuously looking for new bodies to inhabit, and are even considered by some to be the unclean spirits that Jesus casts out in the New Testament. Okay. That's one origin story for the existence of giants. But it's not the only one. The other origin story involves something a little farther out there, both figuratively and literally. A subject that I can't believe that we haven't covered before now. The one, the only, the Anunnaki. So this particular theory starts with a planet called Nibiru, or the 12th planet, or Planet 9, or Planet X. It spends most of its time way out past the other 9 planets of our solar system. Yes, Pluto is a planet, fight me, and only swings back around every 3,600 years or so to pass through our part of the hood before heading back out to parts unknown. And 450,000 years ago, the inhabitants of Nibiru, the Anunnaki, an alien race very similar to humans with the exception of their elongated skulls and that they're 12 to 15 feet tall, they had a problem. Nibiru was an industrialized planet, but had managed to keep control of the pollution until the volcanoes erupted. Their ash and gases overwhelmed the system and, along with the failing ozone layer, began an environmental death spiral for the whole planet. The Anunnaki have a lifespan of 200,000 years, and Anu has been their leader for the last 50,000 years. Anu has 2 sons, Enlil and Enki. Enlil works with their scientists to figure out that they can save the planet if they spray microscopic gold particles into the atmosphere to reflect the sun's radiation coming through the non-existent ozone. The only problem is they don't have any gold. So they set out searching for planets who do and found Earth. They know Earth has life, but it's just a few primitive bipedal creatures who are less than half the size of the Anunnaki. So they figure if we have to, we can take them. So they send out a party of 300 Anunnaki and 600 Igigi headed to Earth with a mission of setting up a city and mining Earth's gold. The Igigi are actually a separate alien civilization that had been conquered by the Anunnaki many years earlier and made into their own personal slave force. So once they land on Earth in the area that we know today as Mesopotamia, the Anunnaki, under the rule of Anu's son, Enki, put the Igigi to work building a settlement called Eridu, giving them all of 7 days to do it. The Igigi are a little grumpy, but they get it done, and then move on to digging for that gold. And dig they did. For about 150,000 years, with ships arriving regularly to take the gold back to Nibiru. But it's not enough. They need more gold. Enki tells the Igigi, work harder. And what was terrible treatment before gets even worse in trying to get the Igigi to work harder. But the Igigi are done. Under their leader, Atrahasis, the Igigi proclaim, mine your own gold. They collapse the mines and attack the city. They lose and are quickly brought back under control, but the Igigi still refuse to go back to work. Enlil, who's like the top administrator guy, says they're treasonous, they all gotta go. But Enki, more of a science guy, says, slow down, we're not gonna kill them. I got a way better idea. Let's use the locals. They're not really smart enough right now, but if we give them a little of our DNA, I'm sure we can come up with something smart enough to work the mines, but not smart enough to ask questions. It takes a few tries to get it right, giving us a few mistakes along the way, like the Cyclops, but they managed to develop a race of hominid that we know today as Homo sapien, the first of which they name Adamu, which means first man in Sumerian. And if you haven't guessed already, how long ago did Homo sapiens enter the fossil record, according to mainstream archaeology? About 300,000 years ago, right about the time the Igigi call it quits. So, okay, problem solved. Now we have this custom-made local force to dig for us, and the mining continues. But it turns out that human nature isn't just for humans. I don't know if it's out of boredom or because after being here 150,000 years, he's starting to get the itch to settle down and start a family or what, but Enki starts eyeing the human women and starts messing around. Big no-no. But he does it anyway, and to no one's surprise, has a son named Adapa. So Adapa, being part Anunnaki and part human, is a little smarter than the other humans. And his lineage starts asking questions. Why are we mining gold? Gold must be important. I want some of that. Beginning our preoccupation as a species with gold as a valued commodity. And Adapa's offspring are not as docile as their forefathers. They fight back. And either through violence or attrition, the new aggressive human 2.0 thrives, and the more docile human 1.0 dies out. But human 2.0 turns out to be a little too successful. They overpopulate the cities and start riots over the lack of food. Enlil, ever the administrator, tries to control the violence by thinning the population through plagues and famine. Enki intercedes on their behalf, and a deal is struck that humans would have to leave the city of Eridu, including its lush and beautiful garden named Eden, and fend for themselves in the real world. So they do, and spread themselves out all over the planet. Now, some humans retain their relationships with the Anunnaki, producing hybrid offspring that sometimes, to humans at least, are giants. Some of them are still known today, giants like Gilgamesh, Hercules, and Samson, all pretty much good guys. On the flip side, relationships with the Igigi produce giants of the not-so-nice variety, like Goliath, who are a little more ill-tempered and tend to eat humans. But that is the state of affairs for a while, until we roll around to 12 to 13,000 years ago. The Anunnaki have all the gold they need, and Nibiru is on course to swing back around for an easy pickup of any Anunnakians left on Earth. So they all pretty much say adios and thanks for all the gold, leaving humanity to fend for itself. However, the problem is that Nibiru doesn't exactly follow the same exact path every time it swings in for a visit. It varies a bit, sometimes further away, sometimes closer. And this pass is going to be a close one. So close that the gravitational pull between the two will be so strong that it's pretty much going to wreck Earth as we know it. Floods, earthquakes, you name it. Can you say Younger Dryas event? Enlil pretty much says, so what? They serve their purpose, and we have what we need. What's the issue? But Enki couldn't let the humans go so easily. Remember, he's the one who took a human wife and had human children. He kind of has a soft spot for us. Up until this point, we've been doing okay for ourselves, but we're not exactly a shining example. We're violent, rude, and pretty much a menace. So Enki proposes that one good man, Utnapishtim, his family, and a good representative sampling of all living animals be given at least a chance at survival. Utnapishtim builds an ark, loads everyone on it, and manages to ride out the gravitational fury that rages across the entire surface of the earth and restart humanity from the 8 people aboard. Sound familiar? And just like the Nephilim story, giants repopulate in the Anunnaki version of events the same way, either through the genetics of the flood survivors or because of another visit from the Anunnaki. Because even though we managed to survive the flood and start over, all knowledge of past civilization is lost to time, and we are pretty much left to start from scratch. Except Nibiru makes another, not so catastrophic pass about 3,600 years ago. The Anunnaki use the opportunity to check in on us and make some tweaks to their creations, namely shortening our lifespans and decreasing our immunity from disease. But they also hung around for a while to reteach us some important skills before they left again, giving us back our knowledge of language, mathematics, and astronomy. Coincidentally enough, that last pass 3,600 years ago just happens to correspond to the rise of the Sumerian civilization. But whether you take the biblical approach or the Anunnaki approach, the final upshot is that we mere mortals now have giants living among us. Interesting that if you take the biblical approach for timing, it clocks out that the original visit by the Watchers was during the days of Jared, which puts the Nephilim on Earth from 3,500 to 3,000 BC, just slightly before the Sumerians started talking about the Anunnaki around 2,500 to 2,000 BC, which is also the same time frame that the Greeks were chattering about their Titans and Olympians. The Greeks don't throw their hat in the ring for having a true origin story, but their mythological history contains lots of giants that we will touch on in a bit, but I just wanted to throw that in there as an interesting coincidence. And an even more interesting coincidence is the fact that the Greeks have a flood myth too. And so does everyone else. There are over 100 cultures around the world that have so-called flood myths. And if you account for regional variations, that number goes up to more like 300. And consider that these 100 or more stories come from disparate cultures all across the globe. People who are not known to have had any contact with others. China, North America, India, Africa, Australia, Polynesia, all have stories of a major flood almost wiping out humanity. And while modern academia might consider these merely myths passed down over the ages by a multi-generational game of operator, the people in those cultures consider these stories as their actual history. And even more interesting is that many of those same cultures have an origin story that includes some higher power infusing some part of their essence, like their breath or their blood, with something earthly like clay to create mankind. And to come back from my digression following this line of amazing coincidences, these same cultures all have legends of giants. Earlier, we touched on the Greeks having many stories of giants. Between the Greeks and the Romans, we have some of the most famous stories of giants. The Greeks have characters like Heracles, Perseus, Theseus, and Achilles. The Romans have Hercules, Aeneas, and Romulus and Remus. Not all giants, but all have something about them that is superhuman, and all the product of a union between a god and a human. The Bible has Goliath, Samson, and Og, whose bed was 14 feet long, all from Nephilim lineage. The Sumerians have Gilgamesh, who is actually referenced in the Book of Giants, and who is the son of the goddess Ninsun. Now, to be fair, some of these many giant myths talk about more creation-type giants. Giants that are larger than life and said to create certain aspects of the world that we live in. Like the Chinese giant Khufu, who chased the sun, died of thirst, and created China's mountains and forests. Or even closer to home, we have the hero of the Great Lakes region, Paul Bunyan, who created Minnesota's 10,000 lakes with his footprints and the hills, valleys, and the Great Lakes by wrestling with Babe, his blue ox. But today, we are talking about flesh and blood giants who walk the earth. Albania has a giant that is as tall as the pine trees with a knee-length black beard who captures men for food and women as servants. The Irish and the Celts tell tales of seafaring giants who raid other ships, enslaving entire human crews. The Aztecs had a race called the Quinametsin, who were 12-foot tall pre-human giants who built grand civilizations, but were destroyed by the gods for neglecting to worship them. The Brits have their story of Gog Magog, not to be confused with the evil forces talked about in the Bible. This guy's a towering 12-foot giant who is said to be the last of his kind in ancient Britain. Known for his brute strength and crabby attitude, he uprooted trees to use as weapons as he roamed the land. According to legend, he was defeated by the warrior Cornelius, who threw him off a cliff, clearing the island of giants for good. The Spanish talk about the Oaniahu, 10-foot, possibly cycloptic giants with red hair who produce asexually and are feared by the fairies. Considering that the fairies of old seem to be some pretty tough and sometimes nasty little creatures, that's saying something. We have legends and stories from places like Malta and Sardinia, the Solomon Islands and Mexico. And the Native Americans? The now famous or infamous Sasquatch, also known as Bigfoot. So it's pretty obvious that we have a long history of giants in our collective consciousness. And it's my personal belief that all of these separate legends must have originated from the same story. But which one? Now, if you're leaning toward the Anunnaki side of the scale, it has to be stated that the majority of the Anunnaki version of how they came to be comes from one man, Zecharia Sitchin, who wrote the book The 12th Planet in 1976. His version of events is way different than those of establishment Sumerian researchers. He is widely criticized for his interpretation of the cuneiform scripts that make up the Sumerian text. And it's entirely possible that he made some mistakes. But what I love about this guy is that after he moved to New York in 1952 with his degree in economics, he was working for an executive at a shipping company. He taught himself to read cuneiform script as a hobby and translated thousands of tablets for fun. Who does that? But despite the establishment pushback, there are plenty of people who back up his idea of ancient astronauts and alien intervention in human development. M.J. Evans, a PhD in environmental geography and longtime colleague and contributor to Sitchin's work, agrees with his assessment of the Anunnaki and Nibiru. Eric von Daniken, most known for his book Chariots of the Gods, wrote several books advocating for the ancient astronaut theory. And author and filmmaker L.A. Marzulli takes the idea one step further, advocating for the idea that both the Anunnaki and biblical Nephilim theories are correct, that they are one in the same. And there is actually some evidence to back all of this up. In 2020, researchers at the Max Planck Institute identified a specific gene called TKTL1. This gene is specific to Homo sapiens, differing from other hominids by one amino acid. The absence of this one amino acid allows Homo sapiens greater neuron production, which in turn means enhancements in brain development, particularly in the neocortex, which is associated with higher cognitive functions like reasoning and language. Now, whether that change comes from an alien hybrid program or from the hand of God, who knows? But it sure put Homo sapiens on the fast track. And then we have the city of Ur. According to the Sumerians, they built the city around 2100 BC. In the Bible, it's the birthplace of Abraham. In the Anunnaki version of history, it's an Anunnaki administrative hub. But in all of those contexts, it was thought to be a mythical city. But just like the city of Troy was proven to be real in 1868, Ur was brought out of the realm of myth by John George Taylor in 1854. And even better, in 1927, archaeologist Leonard Woolley found the tomb of Queen Puabi from the first dynasty of Ur. Guess what? Our dear queen has an elongated skull just like the Anunnaki. Today, her remains are kept at the Natural History Museum in London. And before his death in 2010, Zecharia Sitchin made a request to the museum that they run her DNA. The museum's response? Nope. Any request for testing would need to come from a recognized researcher with appropriate expertise. Gatekeepers! And her DNA has not been tested to this day. However, we do have evidence of elongated skulls elsewhere in the world, namely the Paracas skulls in Peru, and those have been tested. And wouldn't you know it, turns out that those skulls have genetic markers from the Middle East. Those skulls have been dated to around 800 to 100 BC, with some speculation that they could go back as far as 3000 BC. Now, it's not likely that parties from the Middle East were hanging out in Peru in 500 BC. So how did Middle Eastern DNA get into the Peruvian population? Unless maybe they both had visits from the same sky gods who had a little bit more than just babysitting the natives on their minds. Okay, I know I got a bit off track there, but that stuff was just too juicy to leave out. Now, I can hear some of you out there saying, how in the world can you get this far in a video about giants and not say anything about the encounters in Malta and Sardinia, Lovelock Cave, and giant skeletons everywhere? To that I say, oh ye of little faith. Of course I'm going to cover all those things, just not in this episode. There's too much information that we had to split it into 2 episodes. But fret not, my fellow humans. Part 2 will be out right after this one, if it isn't out by the time you're watching this, covering everything from American mound discoveries to megalithic structures, to missing skeletons, to sightings that continue to this day. But let's get back to the original question at hand. Did giants, long ago, roam the earth? Well, I gotta say that just the sheer number of stories about them from all corners of the earth tends to make me think they did. I just don't know which origin story is the right one. But in either case, I think the words of Zecharia Sitchin are very apropos. We did not invent civilization. We inherited it. And remember, no matter which side of the fence you land on, the giants had a very long lifespan, which begs the question, are they still here today? And if you should happen to meet one, what are you going to do? Are you going to rebuke it in the name of Jesus as the unclean beings that they are? Or are you going to hide and hope the Anunnaki come back soon? Ooh, doggy. The topic of giants is a mountain of information taller than the giants themselves. And remember, there's way more information, mainly about the evidence of giants still existing today, that is included in part 2. If that episode is out, you'll see the link right here. So go ahead and click on it for, in the words of Paul Harvey, the rest of the story. Be careful out there, and I will see you here again on the In-Between.